It's often argued that, at least in the parliamentary context, Britain is a classic two-party system, and has been so for a very long time. From about 1860 to the 1920s, the two parties were Conservative and Liberal. From the 1920s to today, Conservative and Labour. The Conservatives have a great stay in power, even though they've taken some very hard knocks over the last 2 years. But this idea of a rough and ready game of cricket, there are two teams, one team in, one team out, is both an exaggeration and a simplification. In fact, in the present House of Commons, there are around 10 parties represented. Some of them are rather small, like the various Northern Irish parties, or even, say, the Welsh Nationalists only have 4 MPs. But nevertheless, they all have party allegiance. There's only one MP who's an independent, no party allegiance, that's Martin Bell, and he was elected in highly specific circumstances, says he's not really a politician, and will only serve one term. What two-party really means is that only two parties at any one time, as I say, Liberals and Conservatives in the 1920s, Labour and Conservatives from then to now, have any realistic chance of forming a government. There have always been third or fourth parties around of some significance, not to go on about the tiddlers. For example, from 1886 there were the Liberal Unionists, a breakaway from the main Liberal Party because they didn't want Home Rule for Ireland. They merged with the Tories in the 1890s, but then from 1900 there was the rising Labour Party, still a minority. From 1922, when the Labour had got there, replaced the Liberals, there were the declining Liberals until the 1940s. Probably the two-party system was its purest from 1945 to 1970, where overwhelmingly, both in terms of votes and seats, about 95% of seats and 95% of votes went to either Conservative or Labour, and the Liberals at one time in 1955 had only 500,000 votes and only and only 5 seats. But from 1960s, the Liberals start reviving, and by now you have a very substantial Liberal Democratic representation as a third party of 46 MPs, and you have all sorts of minor, mainly nationalist parties, Celtic in provenance. But the idea that only two parties can have a chance of forming the government is not, in fact, particularly unusual or unique to Britain. It's true in Germany. It's true in a way in France, where you have two-party groupings, the socialists on the alleged left and the Gaullists and allies on the right, for example. Now, another line is to ask, is our party system natural or artificial? It used to be defined by political scientists and sociologists around 1970 that a natural party structure was one based, crudely speaking, on class and income, social cleavages, while an artificial party system was more capricious, people voting, as sub-Marxist political scientists thought, frivolously or in a diversionary way. For instance, people voted for the Liberal Democrats simply because, or the Liberals simply because they were disillusioned with one of the main parties and they'd go back to one of the main parties. Well, in a way, the natural cleavage suited British politics into the 70s. Labour had overwhelmingly an industrial working class core of support, the Tories a middle class core of support, although the picture wasn't perfect. Other people voted for both parties besides the cause. In fact, the Conservatives would never have got into power if all the working class had voted Labour between the 1920s and 1970s. In fact, crudely speaking, around a third of what might be called the working class voted Tory in that period, and 2/3 Labour. Our political parties have been formed historically in different ways. The Conservatives descend from pre-industrial Tory groupings, from elite groups of the 18th century, when there was constitutional government, but nothing like a democracy. And as voting expanded, they were a top-down party. They were created in Parliament and then had to form sort of branches in the country, in the constituencies. Labour is a bottom-up party. It was an offshoot of trade union organisation in the early 20th century. And it was really a sort of parliamentary branch of the trade union started life. The Liberals started like the Tories, out of Whig and Radical factions of the early 19th century, and then they spread outwards. For a while, they were the most successful of the two main parties until the split of 1886, taking in the upper working class who'd got the vote and most of the urban middle class. And they tended to identify better with Victorian causes like free trade, the nonconformist conscience, often linked with pacifism, and anti-drink drives, temperance. As these Victorian obsessions lost their hold over the electorate, so the Liberals did worse. There was also a split over Ireland. Then, when the Liberals declined, they had to reinvent themselves as a bottom-up party with great difficulty. So you have the liberal community politics of the 60s and 70s, often unkindly called community politics. Between 1950 and 1970 was the era of the alleged Great Consensus. It was argued that the two main parties behaved very similar once in office. Labour was allegedly for nationalisation, but when in office was obviously not going to nationalise the whole economy like the communists might do. The Tories were for free enterprise, but accepted the nationalisations of coal, railways and a few other things which Attlee's Labour government had done 45-51. That Labour government, the Minister Aneurin Bevan, had set up the National Health Service, but when the Tories came in they accepted it. They said they'd have set one up anyway if they'd been in, and they didn't destroy the National Health Service. In fact, they spent more money on it in the 50s, partly because there was more money. So they could spend more money than Labour had done. But this idea of consensus became to be under attack from political scientists from the 1970s. It was felt that the Labour Party as a whole was divided between parliamentary and non-parliamentary wings, but that the trade unions outside Parliament were running away with the party and reorientated towards the left. In the meantime, the Thatcherites, to a degree, under the formidable leader, Mrs. Thatcher, leader of the Tories from 75, captured the Conservative Party and pushed it from paternalism into a revived sort of free market economics. Now we might have a new consensus, ironically based around Thatcherism and water, that Mr. Blair's Labour Party have accepted a lot of Mrs. Thatcher's reforms and changes of the 30s. I heard a talk by Mr. Blair, Freudian slip, by Mr. Blair yesterday evening, where he praised Mrs. Thatcher for reducing the excess power of the trade unions. To hear a Labour Prime Minister or a Labour leader say that in public in the 1960s and 1970s, it's a good thing the excess power of the trade unions have been reduced. They might have thought it, but to hear them say it in public, you'd think you're either drunk or dreaming or subject to hallucinations. So that shows. So there's a new consensus nowadays, perhaps, but a rather different one. The extreme, the polarisation, the drawing apart of the parties was at its highest in the 1980s, a more socialist Labour Party, a more free market Tory one. What about the role of the annual party conferences? Historically, the Labour conference had a far greater policy-making power, but Tony Blair has tamed it. It's now closer to the equivalence, while the Tory party conference was regarded as a sort of national rally, where the Tory elite politicians just cheered up the troops. Nevertheless, Tory party conference could assert itself on policy at times. Now I think the two conferences in practice are converging. Financial support, there's convergence there. The Tories traditionally had the support of business, big and small. The Labour financial support from the trade unions, while both parties tried to get individual contributions from their members when you had to contribute, if you were a member of either party, about £5 a year or something. But now Blair has wooed business with some success, which is traditionally the Tories' domain. So there's convergence there. Overall, the assumptions about the parties, their composition and financing, their policies, the old assumptions of the 1940s to 70s are increasingly outdated, particularly the idea that party support was based on class, and this is largely because our class structure is changing. I believe we are changing from a class-based society, where society is like a ladder, from upper class to destitute, to a middle mass society, where society is shaped like a rugby ball or an egg. You have the top 10% who are far richer than average, and the bottom 10% who are relatively destitute, and the other 80% in the middle mass, are much more fluid. Obviously not everyone's identikit, but the difference in wealth is a factor of 1 to 5 rather than 1 to 20, and indeed in lifestyle. But the Marxist idea that party support was based on class, can be challenged. It might only be a sort of parochial cultural concept of the mid-20th century. In Victorian and Edwardian times, other factors had been important. Regional factors, religious factors in Lancashire and Glasgow, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, which has always been the case in Northern Ireland, and general economic factors, not the economic interest of a class, but of a whole industry or agriculture. The agricultural counties voted Tory or Whig in the 19th century, for example. And today class is eroded. Regional politics, don't just look at Northern Ireland, look at Scotland and Wales, have made a thumping big comeback, and it's more difficult to base parties on class because, as I said, class lines are far less rigid than they were.